The detective at my door knew I was supposed to be dead. My son had filed the claim, forged the death certificate, cashed the check. But I was standing right there, very much alive. He said my son's insurance fraud was the loose thread in a case that could stop him from doing worse. My name is Lorraine, and this is how I became the living witness who brought my own son to justice. I spent my entire adult life protecting my son Greg. When his business failed, when the debts suffocated him, when he stopped calling except to ask for money, I was still there, his last shield. I never imagined he'd protect himself by erasing me. The morning a detective stood on my porch and said I had been declared deceased, I faced an impossible choice: report my own child for fraud, or stay silent like I always had. But the detective told me Greg's scheme was already connected to a wider pattern, and my silence would let him target others. This is the story of how I became the living witness who chose the truth over the lie of unconditional protection. The truth was, I'd been fading out of Greg's life long before he decided to erase me completely. My son hadn't called me Mom in 2 years, just Lorraine. The distance had grown so slowly that I barely noticed it, like a photograph left in the sun, losing color day by day until the image becomes unrecognizable. I'm a retired high school English teacher. My husband Robert died 8 years ago from pancreatic cancer, and after that, Greg was all I had left. The center of my world, my only child. I helped him through college, through his first business, through his wedding, and through the divorce that followed. When his construction company went under during the pandemic in 2020, I wrote checks from my savings without hesitation. When the bank called about a loan I'd co-signed for $30,000, I drained what remained of my retirement account to cover it. I never blamed him. That's what mothers do. But the phone calls grew shorter, then disappeared, except for the ones that came at odd hours asking for money. He used my credit cards, ones attached to a joint account I'd opened when he was still in college, for hotel rooms, electronics, cash advances, thousands of dollars. When I asked, he said it was an emergency, he'd pay it back, he just needed time. I believed him because I needed to believe him. The last real conversation we had was in November of 2022. He asked me to sell the house, to give him the equity so he could start over. I said no. I told him the house was the last thing I had from his father, the place where Robert had built the bookshelves in the living room, where his hands had left marks on every doorknob and windowsill. Greg slammed the phone down. 6 months of silence followed, and in that quiet, something essential between us broke. Then came April 5th, a Friday, the afternoon light falling soft across my porch. I heard the doorbell and opened it to find a man in a plain gray suit, short silver hair, badge clipped to his belt. Detective Mark Simmons, County Financial Crimes Unit. He looked at me with an expression I didn't understand, something between relief and deep concern. He asked if I was Lorraine Harper. I said yes. He paused, as though the answer itself surprised him, and then he said it. "Ma'am, are you aware that a death certificate has been filed in your name?" The words didn't register at first. I thought it was a bureaucratic mistake, some computer glitch. Then he handed me a printed copy. The death certificate listed my name, my birth date, my social security number. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. Date, March 22nd, embalmed and sealed stamp from a coroner I'd never heard of. My hands shook as I stared at a document that declared me legally dead and had been sitting in an insurance claims database for 2 weeks while I'd been gardening, paying bills, renewing my driver's license. That license renewal, he explained, was what saved me. When the Department of Motor Vehicles processed my online renewal on March 30th, 8 days after the reported date of death, an automatic alert hit the national database. Heritage Life Insurance had already started processing the $200,000 payout on a policy Greg had secretly taken out on me 3 years earlier. The claim included a fake coroner's report and a statement from a physician named Dr. Alan Reiser, whose medical license number matched a retired pediatrician who'd been dead since 2019. Greg had built an entire fiction around my death, and he'd almost gotten away with it. Detective Simmons didn't stop there. He told me the truth about what his unit had been building. Your son's actions aren't isolated, Mrs. Harper. We've been tracking him for months as part of a wider investigation into organized elder fraud. He's connected to people who do more than forge documents. They identify vulnerable seniors, they gain access to their finances, and they convert life insurance policies into payouts by whatever means necessary, including accelerating the timeline when the paperwork fails. He opened a folder thicker than the first, and I saw photographs of a neighbor 2 streets over, Harold Peters, 82 years old, a widower I'd known from church. Someone had used Harold's stolen identity to open credit cards and attempt to change the beneficiary on 2 insurance policies. The IP address led back to the same network Greg had used to submit my false claim. The burner phone matched the one that had placed calls to Harold's bank. My son had not only tried to cash in on my life, he had already been practicing on someone else. My instinct was still to protect him. I opened my mouth to say that Greg must be desperate, that he wasn't in his right mind, that I couldn't be the one to put him in prison. But Detective Simmons looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Not unkind, but unyielding. I understand your loyalty, but if you stay silent now, he won't stop. And the next target might not be as lucky as you are. These people, the ones he's tangled up with, they've been implicated in cases where the insured individual didn't survive long enough to answer the door. Your son isn't just a con man. He's a threat. I stood in my own doorway, holding a copy of my own death certificate, and I understood that the unconditional protection I'd given Greg my entire life had created a monster I could no longer contain. My silence would let him hurt others, maybe kill others. I asked what he needed from me. He said I had to report the fraud, testify, and help them trace the network before another senior lost everything, or worse. But even then, I didn't know the full scope of what my son had done. The detective pulled out a final document, a map of connections I could barely follow. There's more. Mrs. Harper, your son, isn't the only one involved. And the people who are pulling the strings, they're not just con artists. They're dangerous. That was the moment I understood my quiet little life had been a fantasy. The truth was about to drag me into a world of fake identities, hidden motives, and a betrayal so deep I could barely breathe. And the only way out was to fight back, starting with the one person I'd spent my whole life shielding from consequence. Detective Simmons didn't leave my porch that afternoon until I'd agreed to come with him. I sat in the passenger seat of his unmarked car and watched my house disappear in the side mirror. The same house Robert had carried me across the threshold of 32 years earlier. I was legally dead. My son had signed the paperwork. And I was riding into a world I didn't recognize. The County Financial Crimes Unit operated out of a beige office building downtown, fluorescent lights and cubicles. Detective Simmons led me past desks cluttered with case files into a small conference room with a whiteboard covering one entire wall. The board was filled with photographs, names, arrows connecting them in a web I couldn't immediately understand. At the center was a photograph of Greg, and beside it, a man I'd never seen before. Dark hair, thick neck, the kind of face that looked like it had never once smiled. His name was Dominic Ray. The detective explained that Dominic ran a network that specialized in elder financial exploitation, mostly targeting seniors with weak family ties or cognitive decline. He operated as an unlicensed loan shark, funding desperate people, then forcing them to repay not in cash, but in criminal services. Identity theft, document fraud, insurance scams. Greg had borrowed $80,000 from Dominic, 18 months earlier, after his second business failed, and no bank would touch him. By the time the interest compounded, the debt had ballooned to over $120,000, and Dominic had a simple solution. Find a senior with a clean life insurance policy and make it pay out. But the detective showed me something else. Greg wasn't the first person Dominic had sent after Harold Peters. Another man, a former accountant named Lyle Barnes, had attempted the same scheme 3 months before, targeting Harold's reverse mortgage. Lyle was now in witness protection because he'd agreed to testify after Dominic threatened his daughter. Through Lyle, the unit had learned Dominic kept meticulous records, spreadsheets of potential marks, their assets, their vulnerabilities, who held power of attorney, which ones had no relatives watching over them. I stared at the whiteboard. My own name was there. In red ink, circled. Below it were notations I couldn't read from where I stood, but the detective translated. He classified you as low risk. Lives alone, only child, no siblings, no regular check-ins from neighbors. The ideal target. My stomach turned. My son had provided that assessment. He had told a loan shark how to exploit his own mother's isolation. Then, Detective Simmons played a recording. The audio crackled, intercepted from a burner phone Greg had used. There was my son's voice, high and strained, nothing like the confident man I remembered. He was arguing, his words tumbling out too fast. I said I'd get you the money, I didn't say I'd hurt her. There's got to be another way. I can do Harold again. He forgot to change the beneficiary. I can try. Dominic's voice cut him off, calm and low, the kind of quiet that's more terrifying than shouting. Harold is burned. You botched it. Your mother is clean, simple, and you already have the documents. Finish what you started, or I'll finish it for you, and if I have to handle it myself, I won't leave a witness. You understand? The call ended. I sat frozen, unable to move. The detective paused the recording and looked at me. That call was made 6 weeks before the death certificate was filed. Greg was not the mastermind. He was a terrified man trapped between overwhelming debt and a violent lender. But Mrs. Harper, he still made the choice. He still forged the documents. He still sent in the claim. He chose his own survival over your life. I asked the question I didn't want to ask. What would Dominic have done if the claim had gone through and I was still alive? The detective slid a photograph across the table. It showed a car parked at the end of my street, a dark sedan with tinted windows. That vehicle was seen outside your house twice in March. The plates were stolen. We believe Dominic had already positioned someone to ensure no loose ends. If the insurance company had sent an investigator, if you had called the police, you would have become a liability. And Dominic does not tolerate liabilities. The room felt cold. I thought about the mornings I'd stepped outside to get the newspaper, the evenings I'd walked to the mailbox, and a stranger had been watching, waiting. My son had known, or at least suspected, and he hadn't warned me. He'd sent the certificate, knowing it might become a death sentence. But the pivot came when the detective told me about Harold. He had known Harold was safe, that the unit had intercepted the second attempt in time, but there was more. Harold had recorded a statement, and the detective asked if I wanted to hear it. I nodded. Harold's voice filled the small room, thin and reedy, a man I'd seen at church every Sunday for years. He spoke about receiving a phone call from someone claiming to be an insurance agent, asking for details about his policy. Then, a man had come to his door, friendly, said he was from the county assessor's office, needed to verify some property records. Harold had let him inside. The man had taken pictures of his driver's license and social security card before Harold realized something was wrong and asked him to leave. 2 weeks later, a credit card appeared in Harold's name with an $8,000 charge he'd never made. I wept, not just for Harold, but for what Greg had been a part of. The recording ended with Harold saying he'd been too ashamed to tell anyone at first, but he'd finally called the police. The worst part, Harold said, his voice cracking, is knowing someone wanted me dead. I served this country 50 years. This is what I get for growing old. Detective Simmons waited until I'd composed myself, then revealed the hardest truth yet. Greg had come to the police station voluntarily 2 months before, not to confess, but to report Dominic. He'd been terrified after the threats escalated. He'd given them details about the operation, names, dates, the location of Dominic's office. But then, just as the detectives were building a case, Greg panicked. He realized reporting Dominic meant confessing to multiple felonies himself. He withdrew his cooperation, denied his earlier statements, and instead of trusting the investigation to protect him, he decided to see the scheme through on his own. He sent the false death certificate the very next week. The detective looked at me. Your son had a way out. He chose not to take it. And because he didn't trust us, you are now in danger. Dominic knows the investigation is closing in. He will assume you're cooperating. He won't wait for the insurance company to finish its review. He'll act. That's when he asked me the question that changed everything. We can stop him, but we need someone on the inside. Someone connected to Greg who can draw Dominic out. Someone who can get proof of conspiracy on a wire. Someone Dominic won't suspect. He didn't say it directly, but I understood. He was asking me to become the bait. I was the one person Dominic would never see coming, because he'd already considered me dead. I sat in that conference room and thought about Robert, about the life we'd built, about the son I'd raised and the stranger he had become. I'd spent my life protecting Greg. Now I had to protect everyone else. Harold, the unknown seniors on Dominic's list, and maybe, in some strange way, even Greg himself. Because if I didn't stop Dominic, my son would either end up in prison or in the ground. I said yes, and the plan that was set in motion that evening would lead me directly into the kind of danger I'd only ever read about. A confrontation where the only weapon I had was the truth, and the only shield was a police wire taped beneath my blouse. The trap was about to close, but I still didn't know which of us would be caught. The night before the operation, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a letter to Robert. I told him what our son had done, what I was about to do, and that I hoped wherever he was, he'd forgive us both. I sealed it and placed it inside his old Bible on the shelf, the one he'd read from every Sunday morning. If something happened to me, someone would find it. That was the only comfort I could give myself. Detective Simmons arrived at 7 the next morning with a woman named Angela, a technician from the unit who would fit me with the wire. She was small, precise, with hands that moved like a pianist. She taped a thin transmitter beneath my blouse, just under my ribcage, and tested the signal 3 times. The receiver would be monitored from an unmarked van that would follow me at a distance. 2 backup officers would be positioned near whatever meeting location we arranged, disguised as utility workers. They showed me a panic word, rhododendron, and told me if I said it, they would breach in seconds. I practiced it out loud until the word lost its shape and became pure instinct. The plan was straightforward. Detective Simmons would have me call Greg from my cell phone, a number Greg hadn't blocked because he assumed I still knew nothing. I'd tell him I'd received a confusing letter from the insurance company about a death claim filed incorrectly, and that I needed to talk to him in person, alone. The detective said Greg would be terrified. Probably insist on meeting on neutral ground, but he'd come because he'd want to control the narrative before I learned too much. Once we were face to face, I'd guide the conversation toward his debts, Dominic, the forged documents, all while the wire captured every word. If Dominic found out about the meeting, even better, the detective wanted him reactive, panicked, prone to making mistakes. But first, there was something I had to hear. The detective drove me to a safe house on the east side of town, a small apartment with blackout curtains where Lyle Barnes had been living for 3 months. Lyle was the former accountant who'd fled Dominic's threats after refusing to complete the Harold Peters scheme. He was 54, gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes, and he looked at me with the hollow recognition of someone who understood exactly what I was walking into. He told me his story over weak coffee. Dominic had found him through a gambling addiction, loaned him money, then controlled him for 4 years. Lyle had been forced to infiltrate senior centers, gain trust, extract banking information. He described Dominic's operation as a spiderweb. Every person who owed him was assigned a mark, and if they failed, they became the mark. Greg wasn't just in debt, Lyle said. He was being groomed. Dominic likes sons with mothers. They're easier to control, guilt, love, fear, it's all leverage. And when Greg stalled on you, Dominic sent him a photograph of your house with a red X drawn over your bedroom window. I saw it. I felt the blood leave my face. Lyle continued. Greg knew what that meant. He still filed the certificate. He chose the insurance route because he thought if the money came fast, Dominic would back off. But Dominic never backs off. He only escalates. If your son had been braver, he would have come to me months ago and we could have built a case together. Instead, he tried to outrun a shark by throwing his own mother overboard. That was the worst moment. Not the death certificate, not the forged coroner's report, not even the picture of the sedan parked outside my street. It was the realization that Greg had been fully informed of the threat, had seen his own mother's life explicitly threatened, and had responded not by warning me or going to the police permanently, but by sending the paperwork that would legally declare me dead. He had hoped that by making me dead on paper, he could save himself from something worse. But he hadn't hoped hard enough to warn me to lock my doors. I sat in that apartment with the wire still tight against my skin and felt something inside me calcify. All the years of protecting him had led here. He'd traded my existence for his temporary safety, and then he'd convinced himself he had no other choice. But he had. He'd had the police, he'd had the detective's offer, he'd had Lyle's example of what escape looked like, and he'd walked away from all of it. That was the moment I stopped being Greg's mother and became the witness I needed to be. We left the safe house at 11 in the morning. The detective handed me the phone. I called Greg, my voice calm in a way that surprised me. He answered on the third ring, his voice rushed, the sound of traffic in the background. I told him I'd received a strange insurance notice, something about a claim that referenced March 22nd, and I didn't understand why the company would think I'd passed. I said I wanted his help sorting it out. There was a long silence, the kind filled with frantic mental calculations. He said he'd meet me at Riverside Park at 1 o'clock, bench near the duck pond. He said not to call anyone else until we'd talked. I said okay, and hung up. The detective smiled grimly. Riverside Park was perfect. Open sightlines, plenty of natural cover, easy to monitor. The backup team would arrive an hour early and stage near the picnic pavilion. The van would be parked in the lot near the baseball field, full view of the bench. I changed into a light coat, the wire still hidden, and the detective drove me to the park. He squeezed my shoulder before I got out, the first human touch I'd felt in days that didn't feel like it came with conditions. I sat on that bench for 23 minutes, watching the ducks paddle in lazy circles, and I thought about all the times I'd brought Greg here as a child, feeding breadcrumbs, chasing the geese until we were both out of breath. He'd been 4, then 8, then 12, and somewhere along the way, the boy who'd held my hand had vanished. I was still looking at the water when his shadow fell across me. Greg looked terrible. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year, not in person, and the change was shocking. He'd lost weight, his hair unwashed, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. He sat down heavily on the far end of the bench, as far from me as he could get without leaving entirely. He didn't say hello. He just stared at his hands. I started calmly. I got a letter, Greg. The insurance company thinks I'm dead. They said you submitted a claim and a death certificate. I need you to explain that to me." He flinched, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he started to cry, not the heavy sobs of remorse, but the exhausted weeping of someone who'd been holding it together too long. Through tears, he told me everything. The debt, Dominic, the threats, the photograph. He said he'd tried to back out, that he'd even gone to the police, but that the fear had overwhelmed him. He said he hadn't meant for it to get this far, that he never would have let anything actually happen to me. I let him talk. The wire captured every syllable, every admission. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "When you filed that certificate, did you know Dominic might hurt me if anyone found out I was still alive?" He couldn't answer, and that silence was its own confession. He'd known. He'd sent the papers anyway. I was about to push further when Greg's phone buzzed. The text lit up his face, and his expression changed instantly from despair to blind terror. "He knows," Greg whispered. "He knows you're here with me. He's been tracking my phone. He's coming." The park, which had felt peaceful moments before, suddenly became a trap. I didn't wait. I pressed the panic word, rhododendron, quietly into the air. But before I could stand, a dark sedan pulled up illegally at the curb behind the bench, and a man stepped out. He was exactly as the photographs had shown, thick-necked, expressionless, a black jacket despite the warmth. Dominic Ray walked toward us, and the quiet world I'd known since retirement narrowed to a single, terrifying footstep after another. He stopped 3 feet from the bench, looked at me with eyes that held no light, and then smiled. "Mrs. Harper, I've heard so much about you. Your son said you were ill these last few months. Imagine my surprise when my source at the insurance company flagged a query about your file, a living woman asking about her own death claim. I figured you'd be with the police by now, but here you are, still playing Mother of the Year." My heart pounded, but the wire was still transmitting. Somewhere, the van was recording every word. I said nothing, and Dominic's gaze shifted to Greg. "Did you think you could fix this behind my back?" "You're in too deep, Greg. The only way out now is to finish it. And since your mother couldn't stay dead like she was supposed to, we'll have to solve this problem a different way." Greg stood up, his hands shaking, and placed himself between me and Dominic. For a second, he looked like his father, the same stubborn jaw, the same willingness to take a hit. "No," Greg said, his voice cracking but firm. "I'm done. I'm not letting you touch her." Dominic laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You're done when I say you're done." He reached inside his jacket, and in that moment, I saw a glint of metal. The backup officers were already moving. I could hear footsteps pounding across the grass. But Dominic was closer. He pulled out not a gun, but a thick envelope, dropping it on the bench beside me. "Inside that envelope is every document proving your son's fraud. The forged signatures, the fake death certificate, the insurance claim. It's also got evidence of 3 other schemes he helped coordinate. I'm not going to hurt you, Mrs. Harper. I'm going to ruin him in a courtroom. And then, when he's in prison for decades, I'll find you anyway. But this time, there won't be a detective to hold your hand." The envelope sat there, a bomb with no fuse. Dominic turned around, walked back toward his car as the uniformed officers emerged from the tree line shouting commands, and he put his hands up with an almost theatrical calm. They cuffed him, Mirandized him, led him away. But I knew what he'd left behind. The envelope contained enough evidence to ensure Greg would never walk free again. Dominic's final move, if he was going down, he was taking my son with him. And me, and every story of redemption we might have told. The trap had closed, but we were all caught in it. And the only way out now was through. But I wasn't going to accept the ending he'd written. Not yet. There was one more move left. one that only I could make. And it would cost me everything that was left of the quiet life I'd once known. The park went quiet after Dominic was taken away. Handcuffed and shoved into a patrol car, he never stopped smiling. That smile stayed with me long after the backup officers finished their sweep and Detective Simmons emerged from the van. His face a mixture of triumph and concern. I was still sitting on the bench, the envelope untouched beside me, its weight heavier than any physical object had a right to be. Greg had collapsed onto the grass, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking. He'd stood between me and Dominic at the last second, but I didn't know yet whether that was redemption or reflex. The detective picked up the envelope, opened it carefully, and scanned the contents with a flashlight even though the afternoon sun was bright. His expression darkened with every page. "He wasn't bluffing," Simmons said quietly. "This is a full evidentiary package. Bank records, notarized forgeries, even screenshots of text messages where Greg explicitly references the fraud." Dominic prepared for this moment. If he was going to be arrested, he wanted to make sure Greg went down with him, and he wanted you to watch it happen. I asked if the evidence was admissible. The detective nodded slowly. Some of it. Enough to guarantee charges. He's not exaggerating about the prison time. I looked at my son, still on the ground, and felt a strange calm settle over me. The worst had already happened. The only thing left was to decide what kind of ending I would write. Greg was charged 3 days later with multiple counts of insurance fraud, forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The news made the local paper, then the regional networks. Gregory Harper, 45, of Cedar Grove, arrested in an elaborate scheme to fake his mother's death for $200,000. The mugshot they published wasn't the boy I'd raised. It was a hollowed-out man whose eyes had forgotten how to hope. Neighbors I'd known for decades suddenly looked at me differently. Some with pity, some with suspicion. As though I must have done something to create a son capable of this. I stopped answering the door for a week. But the charges against Greg were only one part of the legal puzzle. Dominic Ray's arrest triggered a federal investigation that spread across 4 states. The task force uncovered a network of 14 operatives, all working variations of the same scheme, loan sharks targeting desperate relatives, forcing them to identify vulnerable seniors, manufacturing death certificates, and siphoning insurance payouts. At least 7 seniors had been directly victimized, and the task force suspected involvement in 2 deaths that had been ruled natural causes but now looked suspicious. Dominic, it turned out, had been doing this for nearly a decade. The man who'd smiled at me in the park was facing life in prison without parole, and for the first time, I understood that my decision to wear the wire hadn't just saved me, it had dismantled an entire criminal enterprise. The evidence Dominic had thrown at me became both a weapon and a wound. Yes, it documented Greg's crimes in excruciating detail, but it also documented his terror. Among the papers were transcripts of calls where Greg had begged for more time, offered alternative targets to spare me, tried to negotiate his way out. The prosecution used those transcripts to establish a pattern of coercion, and Greg's defense attorney, a public defender named Sarah Chen, who looked barely 30 but argued like a veteran, built a case for duress. Greg had been threatened, his mother's life explicitly on the line, and while that didn't excuse the fraud, it changed the legal calculus. Sarah Chen came to my house one evening in May, carrying a box of case files and an expression of cautious hope. She explained that if Greg cooperated fully, testified against Dominic, and accepted responsibility without reservation, the state might offer a reduced sentence, perhaps 5 to 7 years instead of 15. But the key, she said, was my testimony. No one else can humanize him to a jury, she told me. You're the victim, but you're also his mother. If you can stand up and say that you want accountability but not vengeance, it could make all the difference. I sat with that for 3 days. I thought about Robert, about the Bible letter I'd written before the wire, about the years of quiet enabling that had brought us to this precipice. I realized that unconditional love had been part of the problem, that true love meant holding Greg accountable, not shielding him from consequences. If I couldn't do that now, then everything the detective and I had fought for would be meaningless. The trial began in August. I took the stand on the 4th day, dressed in the same blue blouse I'd worn to Robert's funeral. The courtroom was packed, reporters, victims' advocates, a few of Harold Peters' relatives. Greg sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit, his eyes fixed on me as I swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor asked me to describe the moment I learned I was dead. I did, my voice steady. She asked if I'd ever suspected Greg was capable of this. I said no, and then I added something I hadn't planned. But I should have. I'd been protecting him from consequences his whole life. I thought that was love. It wasn't. It was fear. Fear of losing the last person who mattered to me. Sarah Chen rose for cross-examination and asked the question I'd been dreading. Mrs. Harper, do you believe your son is a monster? I looked at Greg. He was crying silently, tears tracking down his cheeks, and I saw not the 45-year-old defendant, but the 4-year-old who'd chased geese at Riverside Park. No, I said. I believe he's a man who made terrible choices under terrible pressure, and I believe he must answer for those choices. But I also believe he can be redeemed. If he chooses to be. That testimony, captured on courtroom cameras, became the moment the narrative shifted. The jury convicted Greg on 3 counts, but acquitted him on the more serious conspiracy charges. The judge, citing the duress evidence and my victim impact statement, sentenced him to 6 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 4. Dominic Ray received 25 to life, plus additional federal time for racketeering. The network was dismantled. Harold Peters got his money back. And 7 other families received letters from the prosecutor's office explaining how their loved ones had been targeted, with resources to protect themselves moving forward. But the surprising detail, the one I didn't learn until months later, came from Greg himself. During his allocution, just before sentencing, he revealed that he'd kept a journal during the worst months of the scheme. He'd written down every threat Dominic made, every payment demanded, every moment he'd considered ending his own life rather than going through with the fraud. That journal, he'd hidden in a safety deposit box under a false name, and he'd mailed the key to Detective Simmons the night before his arrest. It contained details even The Wire hadn't captured. Dominic's connections to a larger organized crime ring operating across state lines, names of corrupt officials who'd looked the other way. Evidence that ultimately led to 3 more indictments in 2 states. Greg had done something right, in the end. Not enough to erase what he'd done, but enough to prove that the man who stood between me and Dominic in the park wasn't a complete stranger. The boy I raised was still in there, buried under years of bad decisions and worse company. Prison, I hoped, would give him the space to dig himself out. I visited him for the first time 6 months after sentencing. The visitation room was gray and cold, the kind of institutional space that strips all warmth from human interaction. He sat across from me in an orange jumpsuit, his hair shorter, his face clearer than I'd seen it in years. He looked healthier in prison than he had in freedom, and that told me everything I needed to know about the life he'd been living. We talked for an hour. He apologized, not the desperate, weeping apologies of the park bench, but a quiet, measured accounting of what he'd done. He didn't make excuses. He told me he was in a therapy program, that he'd started reading again, that a former professor was sending him books on ethics and philosophy. He said he was trying to understand how he'd become the kind of person who could file a death certificate on his own mother. I kept telling myself I was protecting you, he said. But that was a lie. I was protecting myself, and I was willing to sacrifice you to do it. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for that, I reached across the table and took his hand. It was the first time I'd touched my son in over a year. Forgiveness isn't something you earn, I told him. It's something you accept when it's offered. I'm offering it. What you do with it is up to you. He nodded, tears in his eyes, and I knew that whatever happened next, we had both survived something that should have destroyed us. The envelope Dominic left on that park bench hadn't been the end of our story. It had been the beginning of a harder, truer chapter, one where love meant truth and protection meant letting go. The quiet life I'd once known was gone, replaced by something more complicated and more honest. I'd learned that being a mother didn't mean shielding my child from every consequence. It meant standing in the wreckage of his choices and saying, "This is what happened. Now let's build something better." The boy who'd chased geese was gone. The man he was becoming was someone I was still learning to know. And that, I realized, was the real reward. Not justice, not vindication, but the chance to start again, from the truth. I think about that word, truth, a lot now. It was the one thing I avoided for years, hiding behind the language of love and loyalty while my son sank deeper. The detective who appeared at my door told me the truth would set me free, but he forgot to mention how much it would hurt first. It hurt to testify, to see my son in handcuffs, to accept that I'd been an accomplice to my own erasure by never demanding better from him. But that pain was the price of being alive again. I'm no longer the woman who was declared dead. I'm the one who proved she was still here, still capable, still able to choose a different ending. And here's what I've learned about the people who prey on the elderly. They succeed because they count on our silence. They count on the shame that keeps us from reporting our own children, the isolation that makes us grateful for any contact at all, the deep-seated fear that if we speak up, we'll lose the last family we have. Dominic Ray built an empire on that silence, and Greg almost became his most successful instrument. The only way to break that cycle is to speak, to the police, to a neighbor, to anyone who will listen before the documents are signed. I waited until a detective was already on my doorstep. You don't have to. I still live in the same house, the one Robert built the bookshelves in. I still go to church and see Harold Peters in the back row, and we nod to each other with the understanding of people who've been through something unspeakable and survived. Greg writes me letters now, real letters on paper, not the quick texts he used to send asking for money. He's studying for a degree through a prison correspondence program, and when he calls, he asks how I'm doing first, before he says anything about himself. It's a small change, but it's everything. We're rebuilding, not from the fantasy we had before, but from the wreckage. And strangely, it feels more solid than anything we ever built on pretend. I still have the letter I wrote to Robert the night before the operation. I never had to deliver it, but I keep it in his Bible as a reminder of how close I came to losing everything. That letter represents a line I almost crossed, the point where I could have stayed silent and let the scheme succeed. But instead, I chose to trust the detective and my own voice. It reminds me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's feeling the fear and speaking anyway. So that's my story. I'd like to ask you something. If you were in my position, faced with a son who had committed an unforgivable act, could you find a way to forgive without excusing? Can love survive accountability? Let me know in the comments. I read them, and I'd genuinely like to know what you think. And if this story meant something to you, please subscribe to this channel. There are so many more stories like mine, stories of people who discovered that our best chapters can happen at any age, sometimes only after we've lost everything and decided to tell the truth. Thank you for listening. My name is Lorraine Harper, and I'm still here.